Yeah. Hello. Hello and good evening. Thank you all for coming on a Saturday evening. We're all conscious that we're sitting between you and the bars, so we will keep this quick and snappy. The way that we are going to probably run this panel is we're going to go with the panelists who I'm just about to introduce for about 30 minutes. Then we're going to open it up for questions. For the questions, you want to maybe raise your hand. We'll select you. Keep your mask on, and then just ask your question, and I'll repeat it again for the live stream. So we're just going to dive into it. The panel that we've all come for, of course, is targeting tech. How do we cover one of the most important beats in the world? The tech beat. So my name is Aman Sethi. I'm a senior technology reporter for BuzzFeed News, where I cover a wide array of things from surveillance to crypto to stuff in the middle of that. I'm going to quickly introduce, there is Anup Kaphle, who is the executive editor of Rest of World. There's Julia Angwin, who is the founder of the Markup. There's Natalia Antelava, who is the founder of, or co-founder of Coda Story. Each of them is going to introduce their organization, so I won't go into detail right away. I'd just like to make some sort of opening broad remarks to give you a sense of how we are sort of orienting the panel. The way that I've been thinking about this panel is that when I started reading about, when I started as a tech reader before I was a tech reporter in like the early 90s, tech reporting was basically magazines like PC Mag, PC Quest, which were primarily sort of gadget-driven sort of publications which looked at, hey, there is this thing called a computer, and it has a CD player attached, and this is what tech is. And over the years, fast forward through Web 1, Web 2, and now Web 3, we find that tech has sort of imbricated itself into every aspect of our life. So it overlaps with almost every aspect of everything we do, from algorithms and predictive policing, to surveillance, to warfare, to food. And what we have today is 3 publications that have chosen a specific way of approaching the tech beat. So to begin with, Anup, why don't we start with you and Rest of World, and if you can give us a sense of, what was the sort of governing thesis behind setting up Rest of World, and how did you decide to kind of slice the tech beat, and what was what was the thinking behind it, and how do you approach it, and perhaps if you could start with that.
Yeah, so we launched in 2020. We're based out of New York with editors and reporters in countries around the world. We have a team of about 28 people, and I think the founding idea was that when tech is covered, it is still sort of like either covered as a business story, but then there is a vast information gap from around the world when it comes to covering technology and how people are actually using technology. So we wanted to fill that gap. A lot of mainstream places, even in the U.S., that have foreign correspondents, they don't really cover technology as part of the international reporting beat. There are a lot of general stories, and so covering technology sort of becomes an afterthought. You may find like an influencer, or you may find like a Facebook's impact on elections, and you cover it that way. But I think we're at this stage where technology is intertwined in all aspects of lives, and we wanted to kind of lead that. So at this stage, the way we cover tech, we're a pretty small publication, so we've decided that we would use 4 focus areas. It's how people buy, so essentially kind of like looking at e-commerce operations, fintech, how people work, and that's kind of like looking at the labor aspect, labor policy, how people are employed, the whole gig economy, how people interact and engage with technology. So you have the whole sort of like social media and online culture angle there. And then the long tail impact of big tech. And for us, big tech are not just companies that are born out of Silicon Valley and operate around the world, but also big companies in countries like China that have influence in those key markets, in key regions, whether it's Huawei, Tencent, or if you look at like countries like Indonesia, you have like these massive companies like Grab, Gojek that employ hundreds and thousands of people. So that's sort of like how we are approaching covering technology right now.
Right. Thank you for that. Julia, just handing over to you.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm the founder of the Markup. It's a nonprofit newsroom in New York, and The markup really arose from my own career as a tech reporter. I grew up in Silicon Valley and actually thought that I would become a technologist. I learned programming in 5th grade and was on track to join the tech industry, but fell in love with journalism at my college newspaper and decided to try to rebel against my upbringing and become a journalist. And then what I found was after some time as a journalist, as tech became mainstream, I was one of the only people in the newsroom who really knew how to code, who had tech skills, and so I was put on the tech beat. And as Aman said, the tech beat in its early days was very much focused on product reviews, and it was not a particularly critical beat. I mean, I would describe it as fan fiction. and so it was essentially like, look at this, amazing new gadget that's come out that's going to change your life, and is it better than the other gadget that we wrote about last week? And that was primarily because most newsrooms identified one person in the newsroom who understood technology and gave them that beat, and most of those people were fans. They were hobbyists. They were building their own computers in their garage. I was unique in the sense that I grew up in the tech industry, and I didn't have the zeal of the converted. I was a little bit more skeptical because I had been in it and I wasn't wowed by it as much. And so from the beginning, I wrote a lot of critical pieces about the sociological aspects of technology. One of the first stories I did at the San Francisco Chronicle in 1997 was the digital divide in Silicon Valley. And at that time, what I meant by the digital divide was actually I went to all the different tech companies and filed Freedom of Information Act requests with the EEOC about race complaints by their employees, and wrote about how they didn't have any diversity in their labor pool, and how they weren't recruiting at places where they could find more diverse candidates, and talk to people inside about complaints they had filed with the EEOC. And so from the beginning, I had a slightly different lens, I think partly just because of my familiarity with the industry. And I went on to the Wall Street Journal, ProPublica, but one thing I found was missing was the use of technology in reporting. So slowly but surely I realized that I could actually use computational automation tools to enhance my reporting, right? Journalists are completely outnumbered, right? There's like 8 PR people for every one journalist. And so we have to use every single tool at our disposal. And the main tools we have are public records, human sources, our own eyes, photojournalism, witnessing things live, and legal fights that we can wage if we have some legal resources to get public documents. But computation and automation has not always been something that journalists have had access to, have had the ability to use. And so when I was at the Wall Street Journal, I started sort of stealing people from the graphics desk who had computational skills to help me with my investigations. And over time, I was sort of overusing my allotment of those journalists. So then I moved to ProPublica, where they had more data journalists, but once again, I started overusing my allotment of programmers. And so ultimately, one of the founding principles of the markup was we have equal amounts of programmers and traditional journalists in the newsroom, and they partner together. And that allows us to sort of superpower our investigations. We can use, for instance, we wanted to investigate whether Google was presenting search results that gave advantages to its own products. And so we scraped thousands of Google searches, and we analyzed the page using automated techniques, and showed that on average, more than half of the top of the page was sending people to Google's own products. And that kind of big data analysis is something that the markup specializes in. We focus a lot on what we call auditing algorithms, which is like the Google search algorithm. We write a lot about privacy. We have a privacy promise for our readers. If you come to our website, we do not track you. There are no third-party cookies. We go to great lengths to make sure we don't use and monetize our readers' data. And then we cover the industry of what I call data exploitation, which people call the privacy issue. And we also write a lot about the labor issues that are emboldened by technology, right? The fact that everyone always thought that robots were going to take our jobs, but in fact, robots just took our managers' jobs, and so they are the bosses, right? The robot is the one who tells the Uber driver where to go, how much money they're going to make. It's a black box. They can't argue with their boss. The boss is totally opaque to them, and so that's a huge trend that we cover as well. And like you said, though, the issue of technology is embedded in everything. So we write about everything from, we've written about mortgage approval algorithms, we've written about insurance algorithms. It is embedded in all parts of society, and we are a small newsroom with 30 people in total at the Markup, but we definitely try to hit topics where the stakes are the highest for humans, where people are being the most affected by technology.
I think, that's fascinating, and I'm going to come to you, Natalia, and why don't you give us a sense of, how Coda, just as an introduction, I worked at Coda, so, I should let everyone know. And
full disclosure.
Full disclosure, and tech is one piece of what Coda does, so, go for it.
That's right. So our origin story is very, very different because tech was not part of our origin story. When we set up Coda in now almost 6 years ago, the problem that we were trying to address was the lack of continuity and context in general coverage of crisis. We are a crisis reporting newsroom that sort of, thematic newsroom that really digs into the roots of global crisis. And we wanted to figure out how can we stay on stories and how can we capture a butterfly effect of something that happens in one place and, then exhibits itself in another far away and so on. So what brought us to covering the tech beat was starting, one of the first crises that we took on back in the beginning was disinformation, and it was a little bit before disinformation became, the hottest, like the thing basically. But the way we treated it, the way we were going to stay on that story was by dividing that subject into what we call currents, into themes that ran through it. So we realized that in order to understand disinformation and as a crisis, and rather than not fight fake news, but actually cover it as a crisis, we needed to understand the dynamics that were running through it. So we were looking at, soft power, at the rewriting of history, at, various ways that disinformation exhibited itself, and we were looking for basically the heroes and villains and the perpetrators and the victims, right, of that beat. And very quickly, because we have that sort of thematic approach, very quickly we realized that it was impossible to cover the crisis of disinformation without looking at tech, and both the use of tech, the abuse of tech, and how, so tech became one of the beats, and we now call it kind of has spun out sort of into kind of a main channel, and within tech we look at surveillance. We have recently added biometrics because increasingly biometrics are being used to sort of crack down on dissent around the world. We are by definition very global because what we want to do is to connect these themes and make the connections. So we look for illustrations of the crisis that we cover across the world. And more and more, obviously, tech is part of it, and tech is part of every conflict and every crisis. And you look like you need to stop me. So.
No, I do need to stop you, but I'm also going to interrupt you. But there is also an authoritarian tech kind of aspect
yes,
that you
so
may
the
want
way
to share.
The way basically we treat the tech beat is that we look at the abuse of technology to advance authoritarian agendas. whether it is by groups or organizations or governments and so on.
Right. I mean, I think what I find really fascinating about these, each of your organizations is that they really give us a sense of not just the fact that there's a lot of tech out there and it does a lot of things, but also about the many layers at which tech intersects with our lives. So if you on the one hand you have the markups, more sort of, we're going to show you the algorithmic receipts kind of approach to work, to important stories. And then you have a more kind of, narrative-driven approach that Rest of World takes with some of its stories. And then you have, Coda's idea of, hey, let me kind of connect tech to some of the biggest crises of our times and show you how it is either a good or bad actor in these moments. Anup, one of the things that I understand also through this panel, if I am making characterizations of your organization that are not correct, please don't hesitate to correct me. But Anup, what I understand with Rest of World was that there was quite a deliberate editorial decision to think about tech geographically, which kind of sets you apart from the way other newsrooms look at this. Can you give us like a kind of deeper dive into what that thinking really was? And also that once you started doing that, could you maybe give us a couple of, and everyone please keep it short, like a couple of examples of stories and the kinds of insights they generated?
You mean in terms of audience in the beginning?
Not in terms of audience, just in terms of like, we did this story and we realized that, how Uber in, say, another part of the world, or like, explain like that idea.
So your first question about geography, I think we call ourselves Rest of World because our founder Sophie Schmidt wanted to reclaim the word Rest of World, which is essentially a business term. It kind of like reduces a lot of countries in a graph to like there's U.S., U.K., and then there is Rest of World. So we wanted to reclaim that and just focus on non-Western countries. So that's what we do. We only write about non-Western countries. That was the idea. But it isn't just about focusing on stories from those places. It's really kind of like elevating voices in terms of reporting from those places. So we rely on freelance correspondents in those countries. We train local journalists to work with our editors who are based in key hubs around the world and then do those kind of stories. So that's at the core of how we do things. And in many ways, like I often sort of like talk about my own experience of like what drew me to Rest of World. I'm from Nepal. I was born and raised in Nepal, and I had I've been incredibly lucky to practice journalism in the U.S. I've worked for the Washington Post, for BuzzFeed. And in my experience, what I've found is any time stories about countries like mine are written, there is a Western gaze, there is a Western lens. And I know like that has to happen because you have a Western audience. But a lot of time the context gets reduced. I've seen my stories kind of like torn apart, and then by the time you read 800-word story about the political situation in Nepal, you don't have any context, right? It's told from the perspective of China and India, which are the two biggest kind of neighbors. So you don't really know how Nepalis feel or what that really means for a Nepali. And I think this is the kind of like approach we want to take in telling these tech stories. What does it really mean for the gig worker in Sri Lanka, right? Like when you're writing a story about Uber. And to go to your second question about stories, I think like one of the stories that was very successful and I think about a lot is this project that we published last year looking at gig workers around the world. The idea was that we would look at the gig economy and we would look at various aspects of gig work and see how people really worked in various places. And it was fascinating to see the similarities between the experiences of someone who worked for a cleaning operation in Johannesburg versus a tuk-tuk operator in Colombo, Sri Lanka, right? Or a truck driver in Indonesia, and how they were being paid. Like we talk about algorithm, like there are so many similarities in how people get exploited, how people get paid, how those business decisions are made by these startups that are raising millions and millions of dollars. And I think like the comments from readers were just like, oh wow, this is also happening here. This is also happening here. So there are these shared experiences. So in many ways, I think like the work we do is kind of like a connective tissue for readers from various countries.
Right. Julia, so, for example, I've just started reporting crypto. And one of the challenges we face is by the time we've explained what it is, it's then time to actually tell the story, right? And so what I've noticed with the markup is that a lot of your stories go what I like to call like geek and deep, right? And so kind of walk us through, like, is this a challenge that you face where you're like, okay, we're going to do something that looks at, say, algorithmically driven predictive policing in different neighborhoods in the US, and by the time how do you take that sort of, this is for the general reader versus this is for a reader that cares deeply about these issues versus, because tech is not just, like, context in tech is like huge, right? And the deeper you go and the geeker you go, the kind of distance a general reader has to traverse before they get to actually your big point, which is no longer that algorithms are being used. It's like there's a whole other thing where we're going. Like, how do you kind of traverse that arc in your stories and think about your audience when you do your work?
That's a great question. I mean, the predictive policing one is a perfect example because we just did a big investigation of predictive policing, and I would say that we attack it from multiple angles. So we did an analysis of a predictive policing software in the US called Predpol. They left, by mistake, it seems, all of their predictions for more than 50 different law enforcement agencies available on a unsecured web server. So we downloaded them and analyzed them. And everybody had long suspected that this idea of predictive policing was going to perpetuate the racial biases of existing policing in the US. And so we wanted to test that hypothesis. And suddenly we had the data to do this. And we did this as a partnership with Gizmodo because the reporter there, Drew, is the one who found the data and brought it to us. And so we did multiple things. First of all, we did a scientific analysis, basically, of the data. So we took all these 7 million predictions, we matched them with the census records for where the crime was predicted to happen to see, were they sending patrol cars primarily to black and brown neighborhoods? Can you guess? What do you think? Yes, they were. And they never sent the patrol cars to the white neighborhoods. So it confirmed what a lot of people had suspected, but we had not seen the data before. And the way we did that analysis was with some sort of advanced statistics, and we wrote a long methodology that is essentially kind of an academic white paper, deeply geeky, extremely lengthy, not really for the general reader, lots of charts and footnotes, and we actually send that out to get experts to review it. And so that runs as one piece for certain type of people. But then we have a narrative, like the story. And the story, actually, in this case, we opened it with like an interactive, a little bit of a scrolly telling, just in case even the story was too hard. It just showed you two neighborhoods, and then all the police are going here, or they're not going here, and then how that was true in other neighborhoods. And so we kind of gave you an easy way into it through an interactive. And then we had a, several thousand word typical investigative piece about, like, what does this mean on the ground, talking to police chiefs, talking to people who were arrested during the times of these predictive policing where it seemed like maybe they wouldn't have been arrested because it was a very minor thing otherwise. And so that is a traditional investigative piece. And then in my weekly newsletter, I try to do an 800-word kind of summary of these investigations. So it's meant to be like, do you want to go to a party and sound smart? Like, here's the few things that you would need to know. And so I hope that through all these different entry points, people can find a way into the story. If we had lots of resources, I would love to do audio and video too, but those are very expensive, and sometimes we partner with other people who can do that with us. But I would say this in terms of our audience, we're a traditional investigative outlet, so we really want impact. We want laws to be changed. We want people to change their behavior as a result of our work. So we are aiming it at people who are policymakers, not only them, but we want to make sure that we have provided the raw material that people who can make change can use to advocate for change, which is why we release our full data sets and our code that we use to analyze it. And so a big part of our mission is to make sure we are providing all the ingredients that are needed to inform the public debate.
Right, that's fascinating. Natalia, coming to you, like one of the things that I really love about Coda is that prior to join Coda and also prior to reading Coda, I used to think about the tech, right? I was like, this is this kind of technology is a worrying kind of technology. But what I like about what Coda does is it sort of stitches it across the politics of the practitioner of the technology, of the person who is using the technology. And so you kind of see the shape of so when you look at authoritarian tech and you're like, the tech is authoritarian, sure, but let's also look at the authoritarian, right? And also given your focus on areas which are like Eastern Europe, Russia, can you kind of talk to us about that a little bit? And again, give us a sense of like stories that Coda has done that kind of work through this.
Yeah, I think, I mean, lots of examples, but I think maybe a relevant one that sort of illustrates, sorry about that, the model and what we're trying to do is, I remember in 2017, thank you, Jimmy, sorry, I'll rescue my bottle. In 2017, I think it was 2017, as part of our disinformation coverage, just before we launched, around the same time as we launched the tech, as it's like authoritarian tech as a separate beat, we did a story. We noticed that there were people it started with like a single person who was arrested in Russia for posting something on Facebook. And then we started looking for more characters, and we ended up doing a video series called Jailed for a Like. And it profiled stories of people who shared, posted, put something on their social media platforms, on Facebook, on some of the Russian, various ones, and ended up in jail or ended up paying a very, very heavy price for it. And that led us to reporting on sort of the legal tools that the Russian government used at the time to do that, which in turn led us to reporting on the similar legal tools that we were suddenly saw being introduced in other countries, Nicaragua, completely seemingly unrelated. And suddenly we saw sort of same phenomena. So for the last, 5 years, basically, we have been looking at how, that kind of random story of sort of one person has the butterfly effect, tracing that butterfly effect of that one story, across as other authoritarians picked up, learned from Russia's experience. And I think this is especially relevant now as the result of the war in Ukraine and the invasion of Ukraine. Obviously, Facebook has pulled out of Russia, and throughout these 5 years, we've also been looking at the reaction, like what have the platforms been doing to address this issue. So all of that, all of the stories that we have produced, and many of them are around the human experiences of being on the receiving end of it, right? Are now especially relevant in that context of the invasion, Facebook pulling out, and suddenly, you can't post anything anymore, let alone post something critical, and you literally will go to jail for 15 years if you write word war, and you can't do it anyway if you don't have the VPN. So yeah, that would be one example.
Right. I could ask these three questions all day long, but I think maybe we can open it up, and we can always come back. So does any questions? Anyone want to start raising their hands? Please go ahead. If you could introduce yourself and ask your question.
Sure. My name is Courtney Raj. I'm a media and technology freelancer and consultant. I think what's really interesting about your outlets, which I love, is that it seems like it's a different model of journalism. You're not competing to get out the story. There's so much collaboration. I mean, Julia, the work that you guys do, it seems like so many of those are with other outlets. So how do you think that's affecting the future of journalism? Do you think that we're creating new norms and new professional expectations that can lead to like a more constructive form of journalism?
Okay, so the question was, essentially how are the approaches that each of your organizations are taking to journalism? How is that changing the future of journalism? And let me add the present of journalism as well. I'm going to throw it to all three of you, but like let's go really fast, yeah? So Anup, we start with you.
I think, like, like I said earlier, the one of the core missions for us is really kind of like relying on local writers in various places. Even our in-country sort of like, reporters are, from that place. They know their issues and, regions very, very well. Another thing is, I think, my personal interest, and I know this is, part of our mission as well, is tech reporting as a thing doesn't really exist as a beat in countries like mine, right? Like, you're either reviewing Huawei's latest phone, and like, I think it's very gadget based, and it's very hardware focused. So teaching people to write stories about the impact of technology is something that we want to do in a lot of these, non-Western countries, and I think that can have a long-lasting impact. Another thing, very quickly, I want to talk about is really kind of allowing these people to lead those stories. Something that we do is we want these people to be taking the lead bylines. They're not like fixers, stringers who are working with, a correspondent that we fly from London or New York. They are actually writing the story. It takes a lot of work to edit local writers. If you have, like, editors here who've done that, they know that they have this experience. So I think, like, I mean, that's a personal passion of mine as well. I've done that. I've been on the receiving end of that as well. So I think that's a change I would like to see in the industry.
Julia.
We also do publishing partnerships like Rest of World, but actually I think the thing that really I want to speak about here is the collaboration we do within the Markup, because we have engineers and journalists who work together on almost every story, and that's a very unique thing in the newsroom. One of the things that I had always felt was that newsrooms had their data people in a silo, and you had to go to them like a service desk and order data like it was a hamburger. And you had to get in line, and like there were a lot of people in that line, and you maybe weren't going to get to the front of the line to get data. And so I wanted to remove that, because I think that data and the ability to collect data is such a huge competitive advantage that it was silly not to double down on it. And so we have an interesting culture that I think has been really, almost everyone at the Markup talks about it all the time. Like, it's a very collaborative newsroom. People are not competing with each other for stories. People help each other all the time. Like, one of our reporters was downloading thousands of court filings, and she was like, this is going really slow. And so one of the programmers just wrote a little automated program to make it go faster. And he didn't need to, he's working on some other project, but like, they have the skills. And I think the engineering culture is a really nice culture, because it's a culture where the kind of tasks that engineers do are always too big to be done alone. And so they are used to this idea of collaborating with each other. And I think bringing that into the newsroom has really changed our culture, and in a really nice way. And I do hope that is modeled in other parts of journalism as well.
That's great.
Natalie.
So I'll do as you instructed, and I'll answer in a very snappy way. Yes, we are the future of journalism, obviously. I do think that public interest-driven non-profit journalism is the future of journalism, and I think to illustrate that, we share a lot of the principles of Rest of World. We also share freelancers. So when Anup edits, this same writer, he's making that writer better for us, and we do the same for them. Julia and I met for the first time today, but I know that our reporters have been talking to your reporters, and they have been incredibly helpful, and I know we have, helped out as well. And of course, you have access to different audiences, and we collaborate. So. I think that's the way to roll.
More questions? Maybe the person on the right first. You in the blue shirt. Oh, you in just ask your question.
Hi, I'm Carla Giuliani. I'm a cybersecurity reporter. So in technology, the news cycle is very fast. So my question is, to what extent is it important to connect the dots, and how do you do it? And how do you do it in a way that it doesn't become like just an explanatory thing, but it still gets some journalistic relevance?
Right. Thank you for the question. The question is essentially a question of how does the tech beat intersect with the news cycle, and how do you basically leverage that in a way that doesn't that that's the question, right?
How do you connect the dots?
How do you connect the
That
dots?
are developing and changing very fast.
Yes. So when events are changing very fast, how do you connect the dots? So again, we're going to go all three of you quick.
Yeah, I think, I mean, we admit that we cannot do news. We're a very small, newsroom that cannot do breaking news and, developing news. But what we do is, like, we try to look at the impact of a certain kind of news event or an issue that has happened, and we wait for a few days. We do what we call kind of, 3 to 4 day news stories, looking for specific elements of, like, whether it's a victim, whether it's a character, trying to add some element, because we cannot, like, do the same thing that Bloomberg does or TechCrunch does or, like, FT does. Otherwise, we just wait. We wait for a time where, like, a reporter can actually travel to a certain village, to a certain city, and, actually bring out the real experiences of people. So for us, we just understand that news happens. We think about how can we sort of, explain that to readers through characters down the line.
We are the same. We don't do fast news. We do slow, extremely slow news. And I think there's a lot of people filling that hole. Like, I don't feel like we need to be faster than the news wires. They all have big tech staffs. The big mainstream papers have big technology staffs. So, Facebook announces they're going to change their name to Meta. We don't need to do anything on that. Like, our readers aren't looking to us for that. We want to do the stories that only we can do and that our special skills can be brought to bear, because it's not in anyone's interest for us to waste our skills, which are very specialized, on things that other people could do.
So this is exactly why nonprofit journalism is the future of journalism. News cycle is fast. The consequences of things that happen are very long, and they're on a slow burn. That's what we're interested in. Let someone else do the news. It has to be done, but we don't need more people doing the news. So, like, enough people are doing that. So we choose not to do the news, and we choose to sort of register the news and think hard about how the news are going to be playing out in, months' time, 2 months, 3 months, 5 years down the road. And I think that's incredibly important, and that's the kind of a thing that you can't really do if you are a slave to a news cycle. And I don't mean a slave in kind of a bad way.
Go ahead.
I just want to say,
Insult any news journalist.
but I do want to say, like, what is news, right? Like, I always think of it this way. If the news would have come out anyways, then is it news or is it a press release, right? Because the truth is, everyone can publish. Today's world allows everyone to publish. So corporations that need to make an announcement, or governments that need to make an announcement, I don't really see, yes, it's important for journalists to add context sometimes, but the reality is, I want to specialize in news that would otherwise never have come to light. And that is what I consider the best news to focus on.
I mean, I will just butt in, even though you didn't ask me for my opinion, but I should also get to say something. I've been sitting here for so long.
You literally work for BuzzFeed News. So.
I work for BuzzFeed News, and previously I was the editor-in-chief of HuffPost India. And again, with small teams, I sort of came to think about the fact that the news cycle is like occasionally a good karma gift that you get for just planning well and working hard, because you'll be working on an investigation or a story for weeks or months, and then suddenly you're like, oh my God, this thing is happening, and then you can just kind of add, you can move your publishing schedule around by saying, let's not publish now, let's hold for 2 weeks, because we know that 2 weeks down the line there is going to be this announcement. We know that we have something that's going to embarrass them, so let them make the announcement, and everyone be like, this is amazing. And then, an hour later we will publish, and everyone will be like, this is horrible. So, that's one of the ways that I think I've been thinking about, like, the tech beat. The person sitting next to you had a question. Go ahead.
One of the criticisms that I heard in the past few days towards tech writers was that, like, of course, they keep pointing out how tech companies do stuff badly without kind of like a more constructive part of it. So I was wondering if, like, you think there could be like a solutions journalism for tech, where
Right. The question is, for the record, that is tech journalism now obsessively kind of working on all the things that are wrong with tech, and is there a space for a constructive solution-based tech journalism? Again, we'll just go on the same cycle. Anup,
Yeah,
Julia?
I think we're one of those places that is like, doing all kinds of stories about tech and tech platforms. A quick example I'll give you is this idea of dating apps is so Western, we think, right? We think that because of how widely reported they are in the West, and in the process of sort of like research, we found out about the series of like dating apps that were targeting Muslims, right? But they were coming out of places like Saudi Arabia, and there was this feature called a chaperone feature in an app that was built, like where the chaperone walks you through the whole thing. I think like I'm giving this.
We did that story. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think like it's sort of like show that like there are these platforms, there are these apps, there are companies that are kind of like trying to carve out a space to help their communities as well. I'm sure they're collecting like tons of data, and there is there is that story
That's where Julia's gonna come.
right, like but we do try to find those like angles. We did a story on like how these gauchos who were collecting Google's like loon balloons in Uruguay were met and like fell in love, and once in a while you find these like incredible stories. I mean, it's also about like how tech brings people together. So I do believe that there is opportunity to do stories like that in places that you wouldn't have otherwise like looked in.
Please.
I'm really sorry to be this person, but I do think it's worth noting that the rest of the world is funded by Eric Schmidt's daughter.
Yes.
And
yes.
so finding a positive story about Google balloons, anyways, it's just, yes, there are positive things that have come from tech. And I don't think there's any reason to ignore them, but I think the thing about solutions journalism, I have a whole spiel about this, I'll make it really short if possible, is the idea that there's a solution out there that people haven't thought of. That's usually not true, right? The solution for hungry people is to feed them, right? And like there are a lot of things out there that we know the solutions to and we don't do them. And so the premise of I'm in favor of constructive criticism, but in reality, the truth about our world is that power unchecked ends up corrupt. And we as journalists are the check. We need to be that check. That is how you keep solutions on track. Even if they start out well-intentioned, they go off track without oversight. And so I believe that our role in society is actually to provide that oversight. Is it always fun to read? No. Is it a downer to have to read about how things are going wrong? Yes. That's why investigative journalism is a public good. You don't actually want to spend all your time thinking about the sanitation department, but you do want your streets to be clean. And that's what we are. We are a public good. And so sometimes it's a bummer, but I think we're an important part of a functioning society.
Nat?
So I have to correct myself not to double down on you. It was actually this. I remember that story. The story I thought you were. We did a story on a Saudi app that on two sisters who had to were trying to flee a very abusive family, and one of the reasons why they struggled to flee it was because of this Saudi app that Google and Apple would not take off the phone.
The platforms.
So that was and and that kind of segues to what Julia was just saying. The solution is actually embedded in there. Like take the app off. Like there are solutions. What we try to do is, I think there's also a way of telling the stories in a way that, makes them highly relatable for wider audiences and makes people who don't necessarily think about aspects of tech to think harder about them and to think about like how they affect your everyday life. And that Saudi story is actually a good example of, how do you, they couldn't get rid of the chaperones because they they were tracking them on that. So yeah, the solution to I'll agree with Julian. I largely agree that sometimes solutions are obvious. Regulation, for example.
I mean, given that the two of you have doubled down on Anup, is there anything you just want to add to this?
Oh, no, I mean, so, because you talked about Sophie, we're funded by Sophie Schmidt, who is daughter of Eric Schmidt. Like, this is a public thing. We put it on the site. But our stories kind of speak for itself. The example that I was trying to give is like, there are happier stories to write about tech for us. We publish 20 to 30 stories every month. Can I give another quick example?
Yeah, go ahead.
I think I was like talking to someone right outside about this Zimbabwean teacher who had aced all the A-level examinations in his country, but he couldn't go to school because he didn't have money. And the story that this Zimbabwean reporter found, which was fascinating, it was a small story, but one of our most read stories, was he was using the WhatsApp bundle to essentially tutor rich South African kids, to prepare them for college entrance examinations. And South African parents were paying him $10 a month through WhatsApp. It's a small kind of, I think that's the kind of story that resonates with a lot of readers, and you wouldn't read about it otherwise, and we like doing that kind of stories as well. That's what, that's part of our mission as well.
I mean, I do think that since this question has been raised and we've had this, I think let me ask a question. Let's have a conversation about, because there has been, let's have a conversation around funding and tech, right? Because I think this is a interesting, important question. We know the Markup is found by Craig, is funded in part by Craig Newmark, who also is in some ways a tech person. We know that, Coda, everyone publishes their funding. And I don't want to go into the specificities of, do you take money from this person or that person? But I think conceptually, let's take one step back and say, given that we're looking at how does one think about philanthropy in the context of tech reporting at a time where most of the philanthropists have made their money in tech, right? And we take one step back and think about this. I mean, the Washington Post is owned by Jeff Bezos, right? So I don't know, as nonprofits, we know that the Post probably has a doctrine that's spoken about in a kind of gravelly voice that shows how they've kind of ring-fenced it. But each of you, how do you think about it? Because let's do this.
I think about it in very simple terms. International reporting is very, very expensive. I've experienced it at the Washington Post, worked for Jeff Bezos as well. I've experienced it at BuzzFeed News, which was funded by VC money, right? And I've experienced it here. And I think when someone is willing to invest genuinely and say I will make a commitment for X number of years to do this kind of journalism, I don't have a problem with that, especially when you have editorial ground rules and you're setting I set the editorial agenda, we do the kind of stories.
The ground rules in a sense?
Yeah.
No, I mean, our audience would not know what that means. So when you say...
Oh, you have, Sophie's not dictating what stories we write and not write and, whose interview we publish and not publish. I think in U.S. journalism, it's pretty standard to have those firewalls and conflict of interest standards. So we have the same standards that rest of the world.
Right. Julia, how do you think of this broader picture?
Yeah, we got our founding money from Craig Newmark, a very substantial gift that allowed us to, take off. And, we thought about this issue and talked to Craig a lot about it, and he agreed. He will have no say at all on anything editorial. He doesn't know about any story until it's published. He's not on the board. He doesn't ask any questions about what we're working on. It's written in our bylaws that the board cannot direct what anything related to editorial coverage. And so we have, like you said, this is. I wish it was more standard than it is, but this is the best practices for this. But we have not taken, Google money or Facebook money, that kind of money, and we haven't sought it because that would just, our motto is big tech is watching you, we're watching big tech. It just would destroy trust with our readers, I think, if we were and brought to you by Google News. And so, that said, the foundations that fund us, Ford, MacArthur, OSF, some of them have tech money. The money is there, the tech money is out there, right? Omidyar, who made his money on eBay as a funder. And so I think that for me, it's about the fact that the money has to come with no strings attached. Like you can't, there's a lot of funders out there who want to direct coverage. They want, I would like to hire you to write a series about my favorite thing. And like, we're saying no to that no matter whether you're a tech person or not, right? And then also I think that with the big tech companies, the current practice they have, like where Facebook is investing in Australia, like where they're paying directly to newsrooms in Australia, that's very messy. It seems to me that a much better model is the one that Maria Ressa has tried to put together, where it's a global consortium, and governments and perhaps corporations will put money in, and it's an independent body that would then distribute. To me, that is the right way. If there is going to be big tech money in this space, it should be placed into a sovereign fund.
Laundered.
Laundered is another word you could use for
It
it.
should be laundered.
Go for it.
So for us, it's simple. We don't take money from governments. We don't take money from big tech, and we don't take money from oligarchs, which
How's that working out?
explains why we are so poor. But there is, there is a different. There are ways of creating the firewalls for taking. So, for example, if this fund that Maria Ressa and others are working on does, take off, and it looks like it will, the governments, absolutely, Facebook should be paying into it, but they should have nothing to do with any of it. I think one of the biggest problems right now around global tech reporting and tech reporting in general and global tech reporting is the fact that so many newsrooms are taking Facebook and Google money. It's a massive problem, and I think we need to stop that and I think we should be reporting more on what it is that they do because their actions have real life consequences for people. And we are seeing a lot of it play out around the world. You can track kind of Facebook policies down to what's happening in Ukraine today, or what's happening in the Philippines to Maria Ressa, or what's happening in so many other places in Ethiopia and so many other places around the world. So, I'll give you one example. Just recently, a couple of days ago, I'm from Georgia, by the way, I'm Georgian, and a friend, someone who runs an independent television station, got in touch with me and said, is there any way you can help us with getting in touch with Facebook? We've tried everything that we can, and we can't get through to them. Our engagement is down 90%, because we're being reported by the Russian trolls. Like, that is not okay. And it's not okay that it's impossible to get in touch on Facebook. And it's not okay that Facebook is having panels at journalism festivals and they're not allowing questions. We need to change that.
We have time for a couple more questions. I mean, the person in the front, please go ahead.
It's kind of related to the money problem and the big tech. It is about access to sources inside big tech companies, because for a long time, the coverage was just what the company wanted to be. They filtered all the news that they wanted to be out there. And now we're seeing Francis Unger, and I was wondering if you see more whistleblowers or people that want to come out and talk about what's going on inside.
Okay, so as I understand, the question is that are your organizations seeing more whistleblowers from big tech coming forward and like saying, I got this or I got that. So let's we can go again quickly. Anup, Julia, and then Nat.
Yeah, I think for us, the nature, the kind of companies are very different. But whenever we published an investigation on a company called True Color last month, that publishes a caller ID that shows who's calling you. So whenever we've done stories like that, we tend to have people say I have more information on this if you're gonna do a follow-up. So if people see that you're doing certain kind of stories, they know that they can rely on you to be shared with certain kind of information. But it really depends on the country for us. I think that's one of the hard part. For a lot of places in US-based newsrooms, it's relationships, right? Like you're a reporter with a certain news organization, you have relationship. For us, it's freelance-based, so they don't quite know where to go to, so we're still working on developing those kind of relationships across the world.
I myself have been a tech reporter for a very, very long time, and I would say that it's been an incredible sea change in how tech employees at tech companies interact with journalists. And I would say it's related to one thing and one thing only, money. So in the early days, the tech employees were paid in primarily stock, and this stock was skyrocketing. And so their loyalty was so high to these companies that prying anything out of them was so hard, right? And I mean, I wrote all sorts of things that were like, you know, would indicate to you that you should come to me, and it was very hard. I would get, you know, I got things here and there, but very limited. What's happened is, as these companies have now hit, you know, just incredibly stratospheric levels of wealth, they aren't growing as fast, and the amount of stock that people have and the likelihood of them cashing out is lower. And as we have reached that point in the past couple years, the cracks have opened, the whistleblowers are coming out. I've been waiting my whole life for this. It's such a joy. And, you know, we saw that with Frances Hogan, we saw that with Sophie Zhang. There's been more and more, and there's so many of them whose names, you know, can't be shared, and we benefit from that too. The Markup, we have been doing this great series recently on a app called Life 360 that lets you track your children's whereabouts. It's supposed to be for family safety, and it turns out they were selling all of the location data to dozens of data brokers, some of whom were selling it to the government, to the Defense Department and Immigration Services. And so as we have reported it, we continue to get additional, every time we write about it, we get additional information. They have since shut down those data sales. Now they've disclosed they're being investigated by multiple agencies, and yet we still continue to keep hearing more and more things. And so, and that's one of my real beliefs about reporting, is staying on a story like what you were talking about is so important, because it's easy for journalists' gaze to switch to the new shiny thing, but the more relentless you are, the more you get.
Yeah, so to add to that, I actually think I can see Isabel Cockrell, one of our reporters in the audience, and she would be in many ways better. You know, she'd probably be able to answer the question better than I can. But I think I think it really varies. I think if it's the U.S. stories, it may be easier. I think the lack of awareness about the you know, kind of global international stories is really staggering within the companies. So, you know, we will often work through, like, I mean, one example, actually, we did a story on the Google's Saudi deal, the cloud deal that they did with Saudi Arabia, despite what happened with Khashoggi. I mean, this is a journalist festival. I don't need to explain what happened, I don't think. What helped us get some of the sourcing was the fact that Google now has a union. So it was through the union that we managed to get some stuff. But it was still, it wasn't registering. There was no anger and no outrage within Google about it, within the union too. So I think that awareness about the effects of big tech's policies, decisions, and most importantly, business models on countries that are far away and on places that are far away is really, really important, because often it then happens, you know, elections first get manipulated in countries like mine or, you know, yours, and then that comes to the US. So these links matter, and they need to be made.
We're going to go quickly for one more. Anyone going once, going twice? Any questions? The gentleman in the back. Okay, one thing that you wish that journalism schools were doing for the coverage of tech, presumably in their curricula or something like that. Journalism schools and tech, what do you wish, like you guys hire people, what do you wish they were better prepared to do when they came out of college? It's an excellent question.
I mean, I think it's just like, I don't think, I went to Columbia Journalism School. I don't think universities, journalism schools in particular, teach you that kind of beat reporting, right? I mean, even now there are conflict reporting classes and, there's business reporting classes, but there is not there are investigative classes, obviously, but there is not really a course that teaches people how to think about technology, because there is a linear way to think about technology. And these things happen in newsrooms and people do fellowships, but I think that's something as we sit here and talk about various ways technology is intertwined in our lives, I think that's something that J schools can take up.
Yeah, I would piggyback off of what Anup said, is that there's a lot of teaching of technological skills, but not critical thinking about technology. And those are two separate things, right? Learning how to build a website is not actually teaching you how to think about whether you need encrypted communications with your sources and what does it mean when a country is trying to undermine encryption. And so those are two different things, and I think there needs to be more on the critical thinking on tech.
I'm basically in a rare position of agreeing with both of you. So, but yeah, I mean, I will make one, journalist schools also take money. Some journalism schools take money from big tech. Also, that also has to stop. I mean, basically, I think it's, I think we need to think harder, all of us, and especially, people who are the future journalists, about how tech affects our lives and the societies we live in.
I think that's a great note to end. I think. So we've ended.